Genesis chapter 1. It's good to see each one here this morning. We have been going through a series of lessons on biblical womanhood, and we want to pick up on that this morning. And what I'd specifically like to focus our attention on is sort of how we got to where we are in the feminist movement. When you hear the word feminism, I don't know what you think, but I think a lot of people think that it's sort of just gotten off the rails and gone completely bonkers. But it started with some valid premises, and it started with some reasonable arguments and some reasonable goals, and then just got progressively farther and farther away from its inception. I want to suggest to you that that is a terrible lie, and that what you have today is not feminism gone awry, but you have a steady, consistent, and logical progression from where the whole thing started. And I'm not referring to the beginnings of feminism going back to the radical 60s, unless you mean the 1760s. And I'm not referring even going back to first wave feminism at the turn of the 20th century, but the underpinnings that were set in place before that. And as we look at this, I want you to see how, you might think, well, if we strip away the bad arguments, then we have a valuable product left. If you strip away the bad arguments, what I want to suggest is you have nothing left. They are all bad arguments. They're all anti-biblical arguments. And so that's the case that we want to make this morning. We want to look at feminism's big lie. Well, to begin with, let's look at the roots of feminism. Where does all of this begin? I mentioned to you the 1760s. You really do have to go back to what I'm calling the individualist Enlightenment, the premises of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is a period of time of philosophy that starts in the late 1600s and runs really through the early 1800s. And it's at the heart of the French Revolution, which ends up being a bloody massacre, if you recall. And so much of that is rooted in making sure everybody has the same rights and making sure everybody is equal in every conceivable way, which you may think sounds reasonable. It sounds good that everybody should have the same rights and so forth. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. But the idea is that nobody is bound to any duty or responsibility that he does not choose himself to be bound to. Every man should have the right to choose for himself what he does, who he owes duty to, what his responsibilities are. And if he chooses no responsibility, then that's his right. That's certainly something he should have the ability to do. John Locke, one of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, who certainly our founders referenced a great deal. He says, every man has a property in his own person. That property, nobody has any right to but himself. I don't know about you, but as an American, there's a part of that I say, yeah, people can't tell me what to do, and people have no right to demand my services or my loyalty or my responsibility or duty. But it is not so biblically. The Bible does tell us that we come into this world bound with all sorts of responsibilities and duties that we did not agree to, that we did not sign a contract for. We just come in and already God says, here are your responsibilities. That's what we see at creation. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, it says, then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, so that they will have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that creeps on the earth. And so when he created man, he said, I made you for specific purposes, to bear my image, to extend that image out into my creation, to fill my creation with that image. He adds the duties and responsibilities in the garden in chapter 2. And in verse 15, he says, it says, Yahweh, God took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and to keep it. And so Adam might say, well, I didn't sign up for this. God signed you up. You didn't have to sign up. You're here as a blessing, and you have certain debts, and you owe this duty and this responsibility to the creation that you've been brought into. But instead of seeing that as a blessing, instead of seeing the blessing of fulfilling those duties and how we might both be blessed and be a blessing to others, the Enlightenment thinkers in large measure thought of this as confinement. When somebody else sets the rules, then you're being oppressed and you're being confined. Rousseau said, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. And it's not talking about slavery, incidentally, except that he would liken the things he talks about to slavery, but that's not what he's talking about. He's saying when you come into this world and society says you must behave this way, that's chains. When your parents say you must do this and not do this, that's chains. When you have the burdens of caring for other people, your parents and your family, even your wife and your children, these are chains. That's what Rousseau is talking about. And man ought to be able to break free of these chains. And so, for instance, in the American Revolution, what we have in the Constitution where it says, or rather the Declaration of Independence, where it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these thinkers thought the pursuit of happiness meant nobody gets to tell you what to do. You ought to be able to pursue, or at least some of these thinkers would have taken it to that degree. Now, some of this is aimed at political pressures. Obviously, as the American founders borrowed this language from John Locke, they would point it towards monarchies, towards oppressive rulers, social oppression, and so forth. But, and some of the, because of that, were legitimate complaints. But much of this was a complaint against natural and created realities. Not just, hey, these guys are being bad rulers, but rather, hey, I was born into a situation that is burdensome, and I shouldn't have to have burdens. I should be able to just walk away from those burdens at any time, at any point in my life. Now, I want to suggest to you that that is, in Genesis 3:22, or Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, rather, that is what Satan presents to Eve, is that you are confined, you are imprisoned, you are chained by the burdens, the boundaries that God has set on you. And they decided to break free from those bonds. And so God says in Genesis 3 and verse 22, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he send forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore God sent him, Yahweh God sent him from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. And so because they saw God's boundaries as chains instead of blessings, then they lost the blessings. And in fact, were enchained to the ravages of sin that they had brought upon themselves. And that is the story that flows out from this philosophy. The law, in addition to the creation story showing us that we come into this world with responsibilities. As you continue on, we've been studying Exodus and Leviticus. It is interesting to note how often the law tells us that tells God's people that they have responsibilities to, for instance, the land. I don't think we think of ourselves as having responsibility to the land, but they did. And he gave them rules and regulations. You live this way and you treat the land, you treat God's creation this way. And they had responsibilities, obviously, to parents. Right there at the very beginnings, the very foundations of the law in Exodus chapter 20, to honor father and mother. You didn't sign up for those parents. Doesn't matter. You owe them this regard. You owe them honor. And then, of course, he talks about responsibilities to families. And note those responsibilities are often contrasting to the responsibilities that the rest of the world is placing on man. God brings greater responsibility, especially to those who are in most need of care and protection. And so he gives them responsibility to their family members, not only to their parents, but their wives, their children, and then to their neighbors. He says, for instance, if your neighbor's ox wanders into your territory, into your land, what do? You have a responsibility. You can't just say, it's not my job. Man, that's not my ox. God says you are bound as a human being to another human being to take care of his stuff. And you deliver that ox back to him as good or better than you found it. And so they would say, that's oppressive, and we want to throw that off. This idea was coupled with radical notions of equality. And when I say radical notions of equality, I mean that unless we have equal outcomes, unless everybody is treated exactly the same way, then there can be no real sense of equality. One of the French revolutionary thinkers, the Marquis de Condorcet, who incidentally stoked the rage and then ended up waiting in line for the guillotine himself, as so many of these thinkers did. He said, why should the rights of women, specifically on our subject, why should the rights of women be any different from the rights of men? Either no individual has any true rights or all have the same. Unless everybody's the same, then nobody actually has rights. Now, when we hear that, we might think, well, yeah. I mean, shouldn't everybody have the same rights? Nonsense. Nonsense. Should children have the same rights as adults? I would say nobody makes that argument, but people do. People are making that argument. The UN has been making that argument and pressing that view out onto the various nations who rely upon them. I've talked to Nevatesh about this. They have the children's sort of Declaration of Independence that they're pressing on to smaller nations who are beholden to them. Should prisoners, criminals, convicted criminals have the same rights as people who have been law-abiding citizens? Should non-citizens have the same rights as citizens? Again, I would say these would have been thought to have been asinine arguments, but now they are regularly treated as valid cases to be made. That everybody ought to be equal no matter what you do, no matter where you are, no matter the circumstances. I want to suggest to you that the Bible does not preach this notion of equality, that this is a man-made notion. And it is not rooted in creation, and it is not rooted in God's law. I've talked before about Leviticus chapter 21. When you read Leviticus chapter 21, beginning in verse 17, where God is talking about who can serve among the priests and among those who are of the sons of Aaron, those who through birth would have the privilege to serve, which is already a distinction, right? Not everybody has that right. So he says, with regards to those who are of the priestly tribe, he says, no man of your seed throughout their generations who has a defect shall come near to offer the food of his God. For no one who has a defect shall come near, a blind man or a lame man, or he who has a disfigured face or a deformed limb, or a man who has a broken foot or broken hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or one who has a defect in his eye, or eczema, or scabs, or crushed testicles. No man among the seed of Aaron, the priest, who has a defect shall approach to bring near the offerings to Yahweh by fire, since he has a defect. He shall not approach to bring near the food of his God. He may eat the food of his God, both of the most holy and of the holy. Only he shall not go into the veil or approach the altar because he has a defect, so that he will not profane my sanctuaries. For I am Yahweh who makes them holy. Now, I don't have time to go into a full explanation. I've preached a sermon on that. If you'd like more information on that, I can point you that direction on why God is not being insensitive here. But the reality is, God says these people, they can't. Now, and then our rush and the rush of these kinds of thinkers is, that's not fair. Well, now, in a sense, you're right. We live in a world full of inequities and unfairnesses. But this radical notion of equality, taken all the way to its end, says it doesn't matter what your physical limitations are, you ought to be able to do whatever you want. And we will conform the rest of reality and the rest of society to what you decide you want to do. Biological restrictions, biological incapacities, toss them to the side. We will make up the rules as we go. That's the idea here. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 Timothy chapter 3, as Paul is laying out the picture of what elders ought to be, 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, he says, it is a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a good work. An overseer then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine or pugnacious, but considerate, peaceable, free from the love of money, leading his household well, having his children in submission with all dignity. Now, whatever else we might say about these qualifications, and we ought to say a great deal, we need to say this. This is a man who is a family man. Guess what? That excludes Paul. Now, incidentally, I've read a number of evangelical commentaries who say if we are not careful and we're not thoughtful about how we apply these, we would exclude Paul from being an elder and pastor. And they say that like mocking, like obviously Paul would be qualified, but he would not. By his own words, he would not. He's not saying this of other people out there. Paul's own words say, I don't fit the description of the kind of man who ought to be appointed an elder. And so there are those exclusive elements. But people who have made those very arguments about, well, obviously you wouldn't want to exclude Paul, have then laid the groundwork for other people to come along and go, well, obviously you wouldn't want to exclude women. We've got some great women, don't we? And shouldn't they be included? And so we don't want an overly rigid, and I don't want to be overly rigid, but we don't want an overly rigid interpretation to exclude good people. But Paul doesn't say good people. He says a lot more than good people. And so we have to take all that into consideration, and we do have to recognize that's going to exclude some people. People are going to have different rights. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and in verse 17 beginning, Paul writes that only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. So I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He has not become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing. What matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Now, he says each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. Were you called as a slave? Do not worry about it. Whew. That's not the modern notion. That's not the notion of the Enlightenment. Were you a slave? That's not fair. Break the shackles, rise up, overthrow the patriarchy. It's not fair. You should be able to decide how you want to live. God says, stop worrying about it, even when it's unfair. He does not promise to give us freedom from the social and maybe even physical restrictions of this life. He promises to give us freedom in the midst of those social restrictions, in the midst of those physical restrictions. But here they're saying you cannot be free if those restrictions remain in place, if there's any difference, any distinction between you and anyone else. The result then was rampant discontentment. And that was the goal, to create that sort of discontentment. Mary Wollstonecraft said this about women. Women are confined in cages like a feathered race and have nothing to do but plume themselves and stalk with mock majesty from perch to perch. She said that in 1792. Mary Wollstonecraft was a woman who wanted to throw off the chains of social mores. And so she went around never marrying and having an affair with a man who was delighted at all of this freedom that she was setting herself free, the shackles she was setting herself free from. And so he could have no responsibilities. She ended up producing a child, Mary Shelley, who you might know as the author of Frankenstein, who followed right in her footsteps and was tossed about in various relationships. Percy Shelley is who she takes her name from, the poet, who, again, was like, this is great, we should free ourselves from the shackles. I don't actually have responsibility to take care of you. And she died, just like her mother, in misery and frustration at all of the freedom that they had gained, because they had pushed away and said all these notions, all these chains are arbitrary oppressions that we need to rise above. Well, that sets the stage. There's a lot of things involved there. But I want to suggest to you about that, the discontentment. It was a discontentment of the upper classes for the most part. Mary Wollstonecraft, as I just said, these women are confined like a feathered race. They have nothing to do but plume themselves. Let me tell you what, the average woman was not going around pluming herself. She was working from sun up to sundown every single day like most of the rest of the world. This was a rich woman's and a rich man's complaint. And let me tell you, nothing has changed. It is the privileged and wealthy who have time to go around navel-gazing and telling us all how bad we have it. And they've got the solution. And they keep doing the same things today. But they're telling these people, you ought to be discontented. God says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 1 and 2 that when a wife is in an actually bad situation, not just the situation that is perceived as bad because this woman and this man don't like the quote inequalities of God's design for marriage, but when there's actual bad husbands. God says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1, in the same way you wives be subject to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, as they observe your pure conduct with fear. I tell you what this doctrine says is if it's not fair, you should rise up against it. God says it isn't fair, but here's how you win him over. It's the opposite. It's the very 180 direction from what these first feminist theorists were saying. Well, then we come to first wave feminism, which is where I think a lot of us think feminism really begins, and I think it's where a lot of people think that feminism has some valid arguments, some valid cases to make. But first wave feminism comes in, and it actually adds fuel to that discontentment fire that's already raging. At this point, we're talking about late 1800s, moving on into the early 1900s. The Industrial Revolution has really taken complete hold. The nature of the home, the makeup of the home, the nature of men's work has changed. The nature of the work of the home has changed. Men are leaving the homes to go work in factories and so forth. And so there's been a massive shakeup. And so feminists come in and they trade on that. And I believe what they ultimately do is stoke the very flames that we see in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, where God tells Eve that your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. That they really stoke that flames. That you ought to be the one in charge. You ought to be in charge of your own destiny, your own voting, your own education, your own property. All of these things ought to be under your control. And while we might look at voting and education and property ownership as reasonable requests for any and everybody to have the right to, the rhetoric was far more reaching. They played on those divided homes, and they bemoaned the realities of marriage even when it was appropriate. So it wasn't like we need to free women from bad marriages. No, we need to free women from marriage at all. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is hailed as, in your history classes, you know, there's that picture of her and Susan B. Anthony, and oh man, we need pictures of these women on our money and so forth, and these are like the founding fathers. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, the Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. She said, the Bible in its teaching degrades woman from Genesis to Revelation. I would say Elizabeth Cady Stanton degrades women, but the Bible doesn't. What she does is looks at the glory that God gives to women and she scorns it. She hates it. She wrote, in fact, a book called The Woman's Bible, in which she went through and turned every idea on its head. She made Eve the great hero. Well, Susan B. Anthony was not quite as radical, but she said this: when women marry, they give up their rights, property, and freedom to their husbands. They become legal non-entities with no power over their own lives. She says they become Mrs. John so-and-so or Mrs. Tom so-and-so. They even lose their name. Yes, they become a part of something. They give themselves over to the responsibility of someone else. They trust someone else with that responsibility. But they also bring to that table a great deal of responsibility and role in supporting that new thing that has been created. We'll talk about that more in a moment. She says marriage, this is Susan B. Anthony, marriage for women is the most degrading of all forms of slavery. This is not a moderate person who just wishes women could be treated like human beings. So when you're looking back and going, well, it started out. No, it started out with people who hate God and hate his plan for the family. And it's not gotten any better since. These are the people that are held up as the heroes. Voting rights, which we think of, again, as a fundamental, people talk about it's a fundamental human right. Let me just say, that's nonsense. It's a privilege. But when they argued for voting rights, they didn't just say women should have the same things men have. They did it in ways that pit women against the home. So we have early suffrage efforts being made that were opposed first and foremost by women. I don't know if most people know that. When Susan B. Anthony and others started, and just so many began making their push in order to get women the right to vote, the biggest pushback came from women's groups. In fact, Susan B. Anthony and Ida Harper, writing an article on this, said the indifference, the inertia, the apathy of women lies the greatest obstacle to their enfranchisement. But women weren't indifferent and apathetic. What they were afraid of was breaking the home into individual pieces and pitting them against each other. So, one anti-suffragist said the vote would strike at the family as the self-governing unit upon which the state is built. Another said it would shift the basis of our government from the family as a unit to the individual. And again, we think, well, the individual is the primary unit. They thought, no, it doesn't get smaller than the home. You don't break it down any more than that. The home is the fundamental unit. And the individuals submit themselves to that unit and their roles and responsibility. Nancy Pearcey writes, why were women so concerned about a shift from the family to the individual as the unit of society? Because it struck a blow to the concept of male responsibility. For if society accepted that a man voted as solely an individual, then it no longer held him morally responsible for representing the common good of the entire household. In short, women were concerned that universal suffrage would reduce men's sense of accountability for everyone in the household. That instead of going to the voting booth and thinking in terms of, I need to make sure I vote in a way that is best for everyone that I take care of, now they could say, they got their own vote. I get to vote just for me. And women said, we don't need more of that. We need men to be thinking in terms of the whole home. If you go over to Proverbs 31 and verse 23, as it's speaking about this industrious woman, notice what it says in verse 23 of Proverbs 31. It says, her husband is known in the gates when he sits with the elders of the land. You see, what that means is she has a husband who has the privilege of being among those who make the decisions, right? The ones who are respected and looked to by the rest of society. Why? Because she got the vote? No. Because she is fulfilling her role. And so her household has the privilege of being among those who sit at the gates. She's part of that privilege. You see, she receives the benefits of that privilege. But instead, these women came in and said, no, if you don't have it, then you don't have any blessings. You don't have any privileges. Your privileges can't come down through the household. They must be your own and your own alone. This opposition was eroded. Women fought back against this until over time, the very thing that they feared began to happen. As men and women lived more and more separate and distinct lives, children leaving the home to go to school and even to work as well, women did feel alone, and men did demean the role that women had. But the suffragettes, again, believed that even a good man was not equipped to look out for his household. Alice Henry wrote, because men, even good men, cannot be trusted to take care of women's interests. You see, they didn't think that the solution was to call on men to be better and to step up to their charge. They thought that the solution was to disregard the men and tell women to go take the place of the man. And the solution did not take away the problems that they were trying to address. The point here is they did not like the created and natural order of the home, even when rightly ordered. The problem wasn't that women were being subjected to bad husbands, it was that they were being subjected at all to anyone. Well, that brings us to second wave feminism, which some of you will remember. This is the 50s and 60s wave of feminism, led by women like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, who took up the next charge, as it were. The second wave of feminism moved from sort of advocating for these poor, oppressed women to chastising women. I don't know if you've ever read, I don't know why I'm even starting it that way. I assume most of you have not read The Feminist Mystique by Betty Friedan. I don't recommend it, but it is shockingly not a book advocating for women, but telling women what is wrong with you. Because what happened over the next several years after the first wave feminism is they did receive all of those things that they were fighting for. They did get the vote. They did get rights to education, rights to work in various professions that they had been excluded from, rights to own property and so forth. And these feminists, or the second wave, were angry that women were still choosing somehow, in spite of it all, to stay home and raise children. And so they lashed out. It was no longer about making sure women had freedom to choose among options, but guilting women into making, quote, the right choice. Simone de Beauvoir, I believe I read this quote in a previous lesson, said, "No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Women should not have that choice precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one." Freedom of choice. Unless you make the wrong choice. And then we'll fix it. Gloria Steinem said this about housewives. Housewives are dependent creatures who are still children. They are parasites. Real defense of women. Holding them up. Lifting them up. No, what she says, if you're staying home, you are doing work that is worthless and useless. You are putting yourself in the position of a child to be taken care of who brings nothing valuable to society. In fact, the only way you can bring value to society is to step out and act like a man. And really, that was a lot of their message. I'm reminded in all of these rebukes that I've read of Numbers chapter 24 and verse 10, where Balaam comes to Balak, and these repeated efforts to get Balaam to curse Israel that have failed. And Balak's response in chapter 24 and verse 10, it says, "Balak's anger burned against Balaam, and he struck his hands together. And Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, but behold, you have blessed them repeatedly these 3 times. So now flee to your place. I said I would honor you greatly, but behold, Yahweh has held you back from honor." That's what these feminists are saying to housewives. Your God, your Bible, your church is keeping you back from great things. Why won't you rubes listen to us? We've made the path to freedom, and you won't even follow us out of the bondage. Well, suffice it to say, they believed raising children, being a homemaker, was of no lasting value, no real societal value. Again, Simone de Beauvoir says the housewife wears herself out making time. She makes nothing. Simply perpetuates the present. Eating, sleeping, cleaning. The years no longer rise up toward heaven. They lie spread out ahead, gray and identical. The battle against dust and dirt is never won. What she does is she leaves out the most important ingredient. She makes nothing. Only eternal souls. Just that. She reduces it down to the things that surround, and really maybe even the most menial elements that surround caring for those eternal souls. And the irony that she says that the years that they no longer rise up to heaven. Oh yeah, because going and sitting in a cubicle and working for a massive corporation, that rises up to heaven. You've taken away from her the most pertinent thing that does rise up to heaven. And brought her to a place where the meaning of work is reduced and left her more despairing than ever. Betty Friedan says, the problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? I'm reminded as I read that of Hillary Clinton's quote that you might remember. She was being criticized for her outsized role in the presidency of Bill Clinton. And she said, I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas. But what I decided to do was fulfill my profession, which I entered before my husband was in public life. Now, political parties aside, I would take a woman who has raised godly children over everything Hillary Clinton has accomplished in her life. And I suggest to you, most of the world would too. What did you do? What did you do? You haven't even saved your own reputation, much less produced anything of lasting value. And yet you mock the women who produce things of eternal value. How dare you? I go and read all of Proverbs 31. And I look at this woman who is not making cookies and having teas, though make cookies, have teas. But look at what she's doing. Only everything. She's keeping the whole thing running. And everybody relies on her and everybody praises her. And this whole passage is a woman talking to her son saying, look, isn't it glorious? Isn't it amazing what's happening over there? And you look for the same. And if you find it, you'll have found something worth more than anything else you will find. So the big lie is this. It's multiple things, really. But I would boil it down to this, that the real treasures lie just outside of God's boundaries, just outside of his order. I do believe it all goes back to Genesis chapter 3, where Satan says that thing that you want, the ability to mold the self, to shape the self, to be in control of your own life, to be like God's. It's just right there, and God's trying to keep you from it. And the reality is, God is trying to keep you from all the real shackles that come with taking of that fruit. Elizabeth Cady Stanton again said, the first step towards knowledge is disobedience. The myth of the fall of man, when properly understood, is a step upward, not downward. She said Eve was reaching for education. What a misrepresentation. That's Satan. You know, Amy and I were talking about this, and in some of our beginnings to read some of this, you get some of the more radical or radical sounding takes. I think it was John MacArthur that we were reading through something he had written, and he said, feminism is demonic. And she's like, well, I mean, and now we're like, that guy didn't go far enough. This is the devil's lie, root and branch, all the way down to its core. Now, you might say, but I like having the right to vote. I do too. And I'm not telling you to throw away everything that comes from all of this movement. I am asking you to realize that these things came to our culture laden down with the poison of the devil's lies. And we have not just accepted the privilege, but very often we've accepted the lies along with it. And it's very clear. It's very clear in the language that we use, in the way that we talk about things, in the way we talk about the decisions of young ladies. Anna, as she goes around, she meets people, you know, one of the first questions they ask, where are you going to school? And if she says, I've decided not to go to school, I'm working on increasing my skill sets. I'm working on learning various things about how to keep a home. And my goal is to be a wife and a mother. Do you know what even Christians will say very often? Well, that's okay too. Now, you might say, well, that's not bad. Do you see what they just did? They said, that's also, it's fine if you don't do, you know, the normal. Right? You're living the alternative lifestyle if you decide to pursue being a homemaker. That's the alternative lifestyle. That's where we are. Shame on us if we've accepted that. That ought not to be the alternative lifestyle. We ought to look at that as the one shining path. I want to say this. When you look at this picture, this guy won Woman of the Year. This guy won Woman of the Year. If you see that and you think, man, feminism has gone off the rails, what I want you to take away from this, feminism didn't go off the rails. Feminism arrived at the station it was headed for the whole time. This is the result of all the philosophies that have been added on along the way, going all the way back to those Enlightenment ideals. You can be whatever you want to be. Biology, rules, God's word, nothing else matters. You be who you want to be. Don't be content with your station in life where what God has born you into. I don't care if you're an Olympic athlete who's won more medals than anybody, you don't even be content with that. Find a way to break out and be different. And to add to that, they came along and they told women the way to excel, the way to fully fulfill yourself as a woman is to be like a man. So guess what? The best kind of woman is a man. You see, this is a logical conclusion. This is a steady progression to the insanity. So don't think, if we could just dial it back, we could just take it back, to just before the 1960s. No. That always, the philosophies there always get us to right here. What we're trying to do, somebody goes, are you trying to turn back the clock? Way back. Far back as I can get it. I will say there's some hope. While this messaging has been very effective, while it has led a great many women, and including Christian women, astray, I think some women are starting to push back. Just the other day, I saw an interview with a woman, very secular woman, and she was being asked, she's single, has a career, and they said, what do you think about all these conversations about children, having children, marrying, not marrying? She said, I look at my sister who is married and has children, and she comes home, or she sees them when they come home, and they adore her, and she adores them. She said, my company that I've given the best years of my life to does not care one whit about me. I have no one to adore, and I have no one to adore me. And they said, so you want to take it back to the 1950s? And she said, give me a child on one hip, another toddling after, one in the womb, so we can walk out and go get the eggs and milk the cows. Absolutely, I would take that over what I've got now. That's a woman who's recognized it was all a big lie. We were fed a load of goods, and the promises have not come to fruition. But God's will. God's promises are sure. He's the one that can say, I know this will work because I made it. I'm the one who put this in place. And so even people who don't know God are starting to open their eyes. How much better the one who does know God to open your eyes and to come back to his pattern and his plan, to embrace it and reject all of the lies that we've been fed. If you're here this morning and in any way want to devote yourself to his promises, to living the life that he promises blessings will come through, and if we can help you in any way to do that, won't you come forward while we stand and while we sing?